All right, so hello everyone. My name is Kamil Rykowski, and before I will start today's talk, I would like to drop a little spoiler alert. That's my first public speech in English, so I'm a bit nervous. And if you got any question or anything is unclear for you, then simply raise your hand or ask the question during the talk. That would be highly appreciated from my side.
Yes, Kamil, one more time, right?
And today's topic is the one which I couldn't really imagine any mobile application without the state and without the state management. It doesn't really matter if it's a Flutter, React Native, or native application. It cannot really exist without any kind of state in it. The talk is dedicated mostly for the newcomers into the Flutter ecosystem who are not really familiar with available options on what should they pick for their state management, but also for people who are using some state management tool but are not really happy with it because there's too many boilerplate or they didn't really like it on how does it fit in their workflow. So more experienced devs already know probably most of this talk, but that's the talk for the beginners. And the topic of it is a Flutter state management with provider. Short information about who am I. I came here from Tri-City area, from Gdańsk. I have a 10 years experience in IT industry, not in the Flutter especially because it didn't exist there. So I didn't have an opportunity to work as long in the Flutter. Mostly the web technologies, backend, frontend, some DevOps stuff, and so on. But since few years, I've become a cross-platform freak, and I've started working on mobile applications, starting with technologies like Cordova, Ionic, Xamarin, NativeScript, React Native, and then I jumped into the Flutter. So basically, if any library or any framework is labeled cross-platform, I'm gonna check it, how does it work, and why it sucks. Currently, I work as a Flutter developer, so I changed completely my career path from web development into the mobile Flutter dev. So there is a job for Flutter developers even in a Tri-City area. I work in a Lab for Life company. That's some local startup. So we simply, as a startup, we took a bleeding edge technology and we tried to deliver best product possible related to long, healthy life. You will hear more about the product probably in 2 or 3 months. It will hit the Polish market. After hours, I'm so-called, I'm not sure if I am, but I think that's true. I'm a mobile game developer, and I'm building my own mobile games. Currently, I'm working on some online RPG, and I picked Flutter as my main technology. Seems crazy to pick Flutter as a game engine. But well, I'm experimenting with it on how can I use it and learn a totally new stuff. And after hours, I'm also blogger, open sourcer, speaker. So basically, I'm trying to put something into the community because I'm taking a lot from it. And before we will start with interesting topics. Yep.
Are you even playing for different games?
Nope. Nope. The game which I'm building is like O-Game or Plemiona or something like that. The old web browser games. Like there is no really dynamic there. You simply click some buttons, something reloads. So it's like application game, I like to call it. If we want to talk about the interesting part of the state management, especially with the provider, we need to understand what the state is. And me and any other Flutter developer totally understand what the state is. We don't really think about this particular thing is a state, and this isn't, and this is also a state. It's quite natural and fit our workflows. But if I would need to explain what the state is, the first thing is that the state are the data stored within our application. So these are basically all the data which we store in our application precisely in the memory, because we need synchronous access to this data. So this data cannot be stored over the internet. Like if some data are exposed to me through the REST API, the fact that I can fetch this data doesn't mean that's my state. I need to fetch this data, put this into the state, then it will become my state. So I would need an synchronous access during UI rendering. So what does it mean? Well, in Flutter, the UI rendering is performed on the widgets level. Each widget has a build method. So to say that some chunk of data is a state, this needs to be synchronously accessible during the rendering of our layout. So the thing which is seen by our user, our mobile user. And the last thing, and that's the most important one, because the two previous items are quite obvious, okay, that would be quite easy to implement. But the last part is about that the change of the state. So every time we change the state in our mobile application, it triggers the UI rebuild. So each time something changes into the state, the user sees a new screen or a new part of the screen. And at the bottom, we have a formula which I took from the official Flutter docs. I'm not a math guy, but this formula I can probably read, and this one I can understand. So on the left side we have the UI, so the layout on the screen, and it's equals to your build methods. So that's a set of all your build methods of your widgets, which as an input takes the state. And it's quite deterministic to render the same UI screen if you provide the same exact state. So that's a really great thing, because each time you provide state, you will get the same output. And later on, I will tell you something about other approaches where this isn't so obvious as it looks like here. For the state, we have basically two kinds of state. The first one is a local state. And as the name suggests, that's the state which is only accessible in a single part of our UI. That's for example, we have some single widget, it has its own state, but no other widgets, no other routes are interested in what exactly is in this state. Why do they don't care? Because they don't have access to it. The state is basically invisible to it. No one can read it, no one can modify it, except this particular widget. And example of good usage, basically from my understanding of the local states, well, the local state is built into the Flutter. Flutter comes in with the, probably you heard about this, stateful widget. The stateful widget realizes the local state. And the good example is, for example, the form data. The form data, I mean, for example, the sign-in form, where the user provides his email address and his password. And the rest of the application doesn't really need to know what email and what password has been entered. I wouldn't really store the password as a plain text in a global state, just in case. I don't need to keep this data. The data which would be stored, that's on the other slide. And the other example is from one of my games. It's a countdown timer. The user selects some category, he configures the level, he clicks the play button, and then he sees a countdown like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I could put this state in local because only this particular screen is interested. How many time do I need to wait till the game starts? That much seconds, and that's it. No one really is interested in this particular one. And the other one is well, if we have a local state, then the opposite of the local state would be a global one. And the global state is accessible from whole application. So we are storing our state in such manner that it's accessible through various widgets, basically by any widget in our tree, by any route, basically by anything. You could think about the global state as a global variable, but that's not exactly the thing. I will explain it later on. And it keeps the important data. And what are the important data? How do we define what's important and what's not? That's tricky. That's basically tricky, and you as a developer need to decide if these data are important or not. And the most important factor in deciding is that, would I need this data in other parts of my application? If so, yeah, that's probably a global state, because I need to share this state to other routes or to other widgets. So it's a good practice to store it globally. Good example is a currently authenticated user. After the user signs in, the previous example from the local scope, I'm putting the current user in the global scope, so I can access this particular object in any route. For example, to display his first name, like instead of providing some messages like, are you sure? I can tell Janusz, are you sure? Like, that's a personalized message. So if that's your use case, then that's good, but there are many use cases other than personalized messages. Other is a products basket. Let's imagine an e-commerce application where that would be a quite simple e-commerce application where we have a single route. Okay, all right, let's say 2 routes. And on the first route, I have a list of products. I'm scrolling over it, and I have a small button, add to basket. All right, so I'm clicking add to basket, add to basket, add to basket. And for example, at the top of the screen, unrelated widget displays this little, in material design it's called chip, I think. This little colorful dot with a number inside, which tells you how many products do you have. And when you navigate into the basket, you click on this basket, you are presented with all your items which you previously added to it. That would be a pity if you store all these products locally, and if the user clicks on the basket because he wants to proceed with this order and he goes into the basket and there is nothing because the data are scoped locally. What's this? Yeah. So that would be a pity. And local and global, and there is heart icon. Why is that? I remember the old days where there's been a lot of flame wars on which approach is good, because only a single of this can be good. You cannot mix both of this because you are building your code base in a concise way. You are not gonna to use both approaches because why should I do this? There's been a lot of flame wars about that everything should be placed in a global scope, and I don't even need the local one. And it's hard to prove that this is wrong, that it won't work, because yes, it will work. It will work if you will put everything into the global scope. But if that works, well, for me, it doesn't mean anything, because if the only thing which we care about is that it works, then today we'll be working with technologies such as jQuery, Perl, Flash, ActionScript, because they work. You could basically do everything which you can do with the modern frameworks, but it wasn't as pleasant as it should be. Of course, no offense to all Perl developers. I've been there, I've developed in Perl, but I don't really want to go back. I really appreciate the approach that the world is changing. And with this changing world, we also got Flutter. Without it, we wouldn't get it. So my best recommendation for mixing the local and global scope is answering a simple question. When you are defining some data in your application and you're wondering, is it a global or is it local? Simply answer the question, would I need this data in any other part of the application? If yes, then start with the global, because you will need this data now or in 2 or 3 days, because you know that you will need this data on a different route. But if you are sure that this data are local, then start local. And if in some day the business guy comes to you and says that this data needs to be exposed somewhere else, well, it's quite easy to transform the local into the global scope. There is no rocket science in it. That's just a refactoring step which we perform on our daily basis, so not a big deal. Okay, so the tough part is behind us. What about the state management? And there is not much I can tell about the state management, because state management is basically management of state, if I would need to rephrase this. And the first bullet says that it's manipulate the state data. Yes, because that's the state management. So we are manipulating the data which we store in our state. And what does it mean? As a guy who's been working mostly on backend stuff, who's been working tightly with database layers, I often like to describe this as crude operations like create, read, update, delete. So basically any operation which we perform on our state and it changes, that's a state management. Let's imagine the scenario that user starts the application. So the currently authenticated user is null. We don't have the user, because how could we know who is he? And he logs into the application. Then we change our state. The currently authenticated user is new user with some fields like email, age, favorite, fruit, or anything, basically anything. That's about your business model. What do you keep there? The same applies for updating the user or updating this basket. Every time we add a product into the state, we are manipulating the data, we are managing the state. And same applies for delete. Jesus. That's only the state management. If we understand what the state is, then the state management is just a buzzword like a cloud, that we are only manipulating the data. And how do we change this data? When do we want to change this data? Well, anytime we wish. We are the developers. We decide on when do we change the state. Most of the time, the changes in the state are performed in reactions to user interactions. So user clicks some button, and then we are changing our state. We are adding new product to the basket. But that's not the only case. So we are not only limited to changing the state in the clicks or taps or anything like this. We can also, like the previously mentioned countdown timer, I simply start some interval, and each second I'm changing the state from 5 to 0, and then I'm performing some action. So that's basically it about the state management. And here is a not yet ready enterprise solution for the graphic designers, so they can discover and explore the world of colors. I imagine that this could be sold to the graphic designers, so they could use this product when they're picking a new color palette in a new product. So he's wondering, what color should I pick? And he's using these universal sliders to pick the right color for his next app. So as you can see, the interface is quite simple. We have three sliders, the red, green, and blue. That's the RGB palette. So the graphic designers knows how does it work and what is it. So for example, I'm dragging the green from 0 to 200. I'm dropping the ball. The same applies for other sliders. And at the bottom, I have the preview of this color. That's quite amazing math. I'm simply taking all these products, providing some heavy computations on a cloud, and then gathering this machine-learned color. If anyone is interested in the code base or have some business idea on how can we sell it, I'm here, so feel free to contact me. We can share the ideas and reach the work together. And here also applies some rule about the declarative and imperative. Declarative and imperative. The imperative is older, declarative is newer one. I've been developing with both of these. I didn't really know that this kind of styles of programming have names. I've been developing for a few years or maybe more with the imperative, and I didn't know it's an imperative. Then I switched into declarative, and I didn't know it's a declarative. I felt the difference. I know that, well, it's a bit different, but didn't really know the words for it. And now I can describe the difference. So in the imperative world, if the user drags this green from 0 to 200, he drops the ball. What happens in the imperative world? In the imperative world, we would need to traverse our widget tree, find this tiny funny guy, and call some method on it that set color to 200. And that's the imperative. We need to exactly say what should happen in the callback. So I'm dropping the ball, and I need to find all interested widgets that they should rebuild. Imagine some more complex scenario where I have, for example, I don't know, I would add here a little circle with the... Okay, easy. All right, technical guy. Not on the...
Pilot this one. Let's try this one. All right.
All right. All right. So imagine that we have added some circle with the same preview, and we want to make it work. Then what does it mean? Is that each time I drop the green or the blue or the red, doesn't matter, I need to find all related widgets, this square and this circle, and says them, okay, the color has changed, please rebuild. I will call some method on you just to make you rebuild. That's totally awful. That's totally awful from two reasons. The first one is that I need somehow to traverse the tree and find this guy through some key, type, identifier, anything basically. And the other thing, that's even worse, I need to couple the sliders with this preview. I need them to be aware of each other. Well, the preview doesn't need to know about the sliders, but the slider definitely needs to know that there is some kind of preview at the bottom. And in the declarative way, it's much better. You are dragging the same green from 0 to 200, you drop the ball, and the only thing which you do is, okay, update the state, 200. And that's it. You don't really need to know that at the bottom is some widget which needs to be updated, that there is some circle, that you have some routes in your application which also needs to be notified about this change. The only thing, tricky, because how could he know that he needs to redraw, is that he connects somehow to the state and he consumes it. Every time the state changes, he rebuilds. So we have a single centralized place where we store all our data. That's why I love declarative. And Flutter is also declarative. How does the widget tree unidirectional data flow works? Well, hard words for a simple problem is that the data flows only a single direction from top to the bottom. Top, bottom. That's it. So my app can pass some data to homepage. Homepage can pass some data to color sliders, etc., etc. But there is no way, for example, for green slider to pass some data to color sliders. The data cannot go up. That's not Angular. You don't have a two-way data binding. You have one-way data binding. You can only pass data down, which limits us as developers, because if we would pass the data up and down, that would be easier to implement some dirty solution. But in the end, it provides us with a much cleaner solution for our bigger products. Yeah, okay, cool, that's great. But how do I achieve this effect? Because each time I change the blue slider, I need to update the color preview. So the blue slider wants to provide some data to the color preview, because there is no other option. The blue slider needs to tell the color preview that blue has changed from 0 to 10. But wait a second, because I've said that I cannot pass the data top. This one is not the top. This one is like a... Oh, come on, I know how to fix it. Okay, not touching it. So how can I perform this? It's quite easy. There is some dedicated design pattern for it. It's a global variable. That's your friend in making a sophisticated state management on your own. You can build it on your own. You don't need basically anything. You simply need to declare some global variable, and that's it. And you can proceed. So the blue slider changes from some value from 0 to 50. I'm updating some global variable blue. It changed its value. It works. As you can imagine, this works because why shouldn't it work? Yep, that's a great solution. The only problem is that the color preview needs to be notified somehow that this blue has changed. And that won't work. In Tricity, I've also had this presentation, and there's been some idea on how to perform this. The color preview could set some interval, and each 100 milliseconds, he would fetch the blue color and will rebuild, and will rebuild, and will rebuild. Yep, it would work, simply. You could even open source this, give it some name, and maybe you will have some users who will use your state management tool. I don't recommend it. Krzysztof will be talking more about the performance in Flutter, and if you will have a bigger application who performs such state management, yes, where each widget is updating each 100 milliseconds on each change, then you won't have this 60 frames per second. That would be quite impossible. In this particular application, yeah, sure, this would work, but totally not recommend the global variable. We could manually handle the change because we can pass only the data down. So what does it mean? If the blue slider and the color preview needs to have the access to the blue variable, we are lifting the state up. So we are moving the state up to the first ancestor above. Actually, so we are moving the state into the home page. So the home page declares the red, green, blue, and it passes down the values of these variables. So home page passes the down to the color sliders. The color sliders manually passes all these props to the green slider. And if we will have a bigger tree with more nested elements, we would need to manually pass this data step by step, step by step. Oh, that could be hard. That would only solve the problem of passing the data. But how could we update this is that each time we provide, for example, the value of the red color, we're also providing the function on red color changed. And we are providing this to the red slider, and when the red slider changes its value, it doesn't change the value of the red. It simply calls this function. So this function is passed to the top, and then it's changed on the home page. It works for simple scenarios. And again, in this particular app, it would probably work because we have 4 levels deep of the widget, so it won't be much of effort to implement this. But no. Provider. And provider solves this issue somehow. I will tell you a bit more about the provider highlight. Okay, I have 15 minutes left. It's baked by community. Funny story, the community baked the provider package, and in the same time, Google has been working on a package called provide, which has been basically solving the same problem. Provide is dead, provider won the battle, so that should be your pick. If you are wondering, should I take provide or provider, then go ahead and stick with the provider. It's easy to read, it's easy to learn. It doesn't have any RX streams or anything like this. Well, it is. It does have the stream providers and so on, but the basic usage of the provider doesn't have much to learn. For example, for the opposite, we have tools called Redux, where we have to learn about the dispatchers, actions, reducers, and so on. So there is much more to learn. It's a testable minimum boilerplate with the star, because I will show you later on why the star shows here. And it's just a widget we all love the widgets. And that's the provider. If you didn't really understand or don't want to remember the previous part because that's just a text, here's a part which you can easier remember and easier connect the parts of the provider package. Basically, we have 3 parts in a provider. We have a provider. Well, the screen is from the game called Donkey Kong from the Nintendo Entertainment System. So at the top there is a provider. So that's the Donkey Kong. The Donkey Kong has this barrels who drops down through the whole road. That's the state. That's the state. It keeps the information about the state. And at the bottom we have a consumer who is Mario. And Mario would like to avoid these barrels because, you know, when you touch the barrel, you die. That's as simple as that. But it also works for the provider because Mario changes his state. He's been alive and now he's dead. So each time you touch the barrel, you change your state. You follow me? All right, great. Officially approved at Google I/O 2019. Yeah, officially approved. Google showed during the Google I/O that there is something called provider and you can use it for your state management tool. It doesn't mean that you should use it. It simply means that there is something called provider and you can use it and it's simple to use. That's it. Dominic previously on the Flutter 3City said the story that
Philip was actually trying to explain that the provider was chosen for the presentation mostly because it was simple, but it was like the only library that could be shown during the 30-minute slot that they had. Yeah, they didn't expect that this choice would be so meaningful in the long run.
Yeah, and it was. And it was because everyone is referencing to this Google I/O that's officially approved. Someone even says that that's an official Flutter library for state management. That's not true. There is no such thing except the inherited widget, but you don't want to use it. All right, finally, live coding. So how to even use the provider? Because I used many words to describe this provider's thing. And I would like to show you how in real life looks the provider. So I'm starting, okay, I forgot to start Android Studio. Today I've updated to the 3.6. The logo has changed. No other things. I didn't really expect anything else. That's good enough for me. Now I will start the emulator. How is the battery? Okay, I've connected. Okay, and I will start my application. So I've already performed the UI part of the application because otherwise I wouldn't have enough time to present the whole provider thing. Okay, so that's my application. I have the 3 sliders and I have a color preview. And each time I change the red and green, as you can see, same applies for blue. Each time I change the color of this, the color preview at the bottom has changed. And that's it. That's how the provider works. Except that I don't have provider here. I don't have basically any state in it. So that would explain why does anything changes in here, because I don't have state. I don't have any state in the application, so it doesn't really rebuild on any action which I perform. So I would need to go into the code and write the provider part of the application. And as from the Donkey Kong example, I have 3 parts which I have to keep in mind and implement. Start, present. Okay, I've already write this down. So the first thing is that we are declaring our class, which will store our state. It extends the change notifier. The change notifier is not apart from the provider package. That's a built-in functionality in Flutter, which provides you an API for notifying about changes, basically. So I've made some state. I keep here 3 values, the value for red, green, and blue. And that's my state. Okay, that was quick. So I have my barrels. I need now my Donkey Kong part. So most of the time, as I want to make it globally accessible, most of the time in the file main.dart, I'm wrapping my material up. I could wrap my material up with a widget. And that would be a change notifier provider, because I'm using a change notifier for my state management. And it has a child, and it also screams that the parameter create is required. And what's the create parameter is that I'm providing here a new instance of my class, the class which holds my whole state. So here I would need to create a color state. Okay, and that's the Donkey Kong part, where I've said that here is sitting the Donkey Kong. He will be dropping the color state, and that's it. I can save the application. You can see that there has been a hot reloading, and I can drag and drop all the bullets as I wish. But it doesn't really work because there is no one is consuming this state. That's great that I've defined that I will be using some state, that I'm providing it down the tree, but who is going to consume it? No one. For now, no one is interested in the state. So how to change it? I need to go into the color slider, enter the presentation mode, and I will change it only for first color, like for the red, just to see if it works. So here you can see that the value of this slider is 0. Okay, that's not 0 anymore. I need to fetch this data from my state, because that's my database of data of application. What do I need to do is I will declare my variable state. We'll call the provider of what class am I looking for? I'm looking for a color state, and I'm providing the context. Okay, color state. Color state? How did I name it? Yeah, I've named it color state. Okay. Import state color state. Okay, I see the changes in the Android Studio 3.6. It doesn't anymore tells me about my local imports. Wow, that's great. And as I've added this consumer here, and I'm not using this state anywhere, so I'm changing here that the value is not 0 anymore. It's a state.red. Ta-da! Reloading. Poof. And you can see that the value is 0. And why it's 0? Well, that's easy. Here I define that it's 0. So I could probably change to 50. Okay, it didn't work. No worries. I could hot reload manually. Nope. So I'll rerun the application. Yeah, this one works. So as you can see, I can change the value of the slider, but that's not a solution which would work for our end users, because each time they want to change the value of the slider, they would need to rebuild the application. That's not the case for most of the users. So what could I do is I could probably implement this part. So on changed, so each time I change the value of the slider, I want to say that state red is a value. And what does it mean? That each time I drop the ball, I'm changing the value in my state. And now that's basically a whole implementation of the provider. As you can see, I will rerun the application just to make sure it's compiling. Yep. And voila. It almost works, but I will leave it for later on because it almost works. That's just some small implementation detail. I will jump into the color preview because the color preview doesn't work. It shows only the black screen. So here to consume the state, I will use a second approach because in provider we have two approaches for consuming state. We have this provider of class and providing the context, but we also have a dedicated widget for it. So I will click here, the blah, 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 wrap with stream builder, but it's not a stream builder. That's a consumer. Consumer of the color state. Yeah, oh, it works. Cool. And the consumer, so that's a builder which takes the context, my state, and the child. I simply ignore this data. And here I will provide my state red to int because that's what it's expecting. I'm keeping here the double and I need for the color preview the int value. Wow, that's amazing. It works. I can change the red slider anytime. Yep, but it's a bit better. I assume that if I will hot reload, yeah. So I'm changing the data. I'm hot reloading, and I have a new value. That's one step better than the previous approach because I don't need to recompile the whole application. I simply need to release my application to the end user as a debug build with some icon at the bottom, hot reload. So each time the user says correctly the sliders, he clicks the hot reload, and voila, he has the color preview. But the provider can do even better than that. And why doesn't it really work is that I would go back into my color state and I will enter again the presentation mode. Okay, I will change the default value to 0, and it didn't really work because we need a tiny boilerplate to make it work. So, because the value would be changing, but it won't notify that the value has changed. Just because I'm extending the change notifier doesn't make this data, these variables here, observable. So I'm making the red as a private variable. I'm making the getter for the red, which will be return the red. And I'm making the setter for it, and that would access the poof, poof. And what do I need in here is that I would need to set my red to a new value. Yeah, Android Studio is so smart that it will tell me that I don't need these getters and setters. But I do, because I need to call some methods here. I need to call notify listeners. So each time you are changing the data in your class which derives from the change notifier, you need to call this function notify listeners. It will trigger the rebuilds in all the consumers which are associated with this particular state. And this time for real, I'm gonna to recompile the application and it would work. Without hot reloading, without recompiling, I could make a lighter. So I could change from black to red, and the same rules applies for the color preview. So if I would need to make this for the green and blue, I could make it, but I'm so lazy that I've already prepared the example for it. That I have this getters, setters thing. So that's the only boilerplate which you will see in the provider. And the thing which I need to change at last is the, why doesn't it tell me that enter presentation mode? I need to state RGB. So I'm providing all other colors here. So I'm providing the preview from all the colors. And I also need the, that's not this. The changes in here that the green value is a state.green and the state green is equal to value, and the blue is the same thing. Its value is a state.blue, and on each change, I need to change my blue to a new value. And this time, probably the hot reload should work good enough. Yeah, that's really amazing. Yeah. Yeah, this one also works. Yeah, awesome. So if you set everything to the max value, you get a white. That's it. That's how RGB works, probably. So how to share the data in the provider? We have the color provider at the top of the tree. And in any part of the subtree, we can connect with the consumer and consume the values. We don't need to manually pass this data down the tree. We simply need some context, and we can fetch all the data, which has been promoted down the tree. You can imagine that if the trees go much higher, that we have, for example, 156 levels of nesting, then it would be as easy as it's now. So we simply need to connect to this particular provider and fetch some data from it. And it would work as it's currently working. So to wrap it up, how to work with the provider is that you need a state classes, which extends the change notifier. For each domain problem you have in your application, you will have a separate state class. So for example, in my game, I would have a user state, the guild state, fights state, basically any domain which I have in my application, I would make a separate change notifier. Use the provider or multi-provider at the top of the UI tree. The multi-provider is just a syntax sugar to provide multiple classes of your providers down the tree. Use the provider of or consumer when fetching the state and want to be notified when the state changes. What's the difference between these two? There is no. So basically, use the one which works better for you, and that's it. Already mentioned that the provider is not only about the change notifier, it also supports more approaches, like streams or value listenables. The value listenable is like a stream, but it holds the last value. It's easy to pick up, and also the provider is not itself a state management tool. The author says it's on the official README page, you can read that the provider is a dependency injection tool. Well, it could be a dependency injection tool, but it isn't. It's a service locator pattern. Basically, it solves somehow the dependency injection problem in your applications, but it's not a standard dependency injection. The kind of the implementation on how does it solve it is a service locator pattern, and I've used it for some time as a service locator pattern. But there are other and easier libraries. If you only need a service locator, check, for example, the Getit. If you want a full state management, which is easy to pick up, then provider should be your first option to investigate and see if it works for your application. All right? Thank you very much. If you get any questions, feel free to reach me. I will be here till the end of the meetup. Yeah, if you get any questions, feel free to drop questions, even right now.
How was it solved before provider was introduced?
I used the library before the provider. It's been called a scoped model. It's basically used a really similar approach. It didn't have the things like a multi-provider, for example. So if you had many classes which provides your state, you will end up in a syntax like provide something, provide. I had like this bunch of code just to provide multiple classes. But if I would need to compare these two, they're quite similar. So that's been the foundations of the provider on how to tackle this problem.
And scope was introduced in the Flutter like not natively?
The scope models hasn't been built into the Flutter, but it's been developed by Google developers. So that's been quite an official approach to tackle the state management. And under the hood, the provider is using the built-in inherited widget. So that's the stuff which you could use in your application without the provider. But the usage of the inherited widget is a bit complex. The API is, I tried to use it, but I love the syntax sugar which provides me the provider. Hope it answers your question.
I did not catch. Where was the artificial intelligence module in
This part I cannot really share with you because that's part of my know-how of this business. So if you know how to sell it, then feel free to contact me.
Is there any API or nice stuff to support this? This is case, for example, you have a list of contacts or orders or whatever, and it's pretty big.
Yep.
And you want to hold the state and calculate the difference of the state in a pretty efficient way. Any API for this?
So you would like to rebuild only on subset of changes in?
Yes, of course.
There is something like this. I didn't really remember how it's called, but it's yeah, it works basically the same as the consumer widget, but it provides you with the option to filter out on what exactly are you observing on. For example, you don't need to observe on the whole state class. You could observe a single field in this state, for example. Or you could even make your class which extends the change notifier to have a field like list contacts, and the contacts itself is a change notifier. So basically, you could accomplish as slow rebuilds as you basically could with the implementation.
So I'll have to write it myself, right?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
So, for instance, for animated list, in Flutter, you calculate the difference between the previous and current state just to animate some changes between animated list. So there are some samples how to do it like in very naive way. They're not the most efficient, but I think they're pretty good starting point. If you go to the sample to the animated list, there is some code to show how to calculate the difference consumed by the animated list.
But my question was more on the point that, in my opinion, I see the lack in declarative UI stuff, in React, in Flutter, in Vuex, or Vue.js, whatever. There's always a lack of libraries for list dipping. There's always a lack of stuff of list dipping. In Android mode, you have recycle list. You leave, okay. In iOS mode, you have a bunch of libraries and stuff that even support intersection dipping. And to be honest, I see a lot of this in Android.
All right, so I have no answer for this question. Basically, I don't know.
In Flutter, there's something called the inherited model, which you can use. It's an inherited widget variation which you can use on listening on subject of some data, and each of the inherited, and actually the provider has it, which is based on the inherited widget, has a way to specify when you should notify the consumers. The consumer itself doesn't really have this capability of knowing when to be notified because it's top down. But yeah, you can specify the equality function, but with mark for any subject.
Right?
Okay, so I think that we can finish this part. Thank you very much to Kamil again.